Hello everyone. Let's talk about Renaissance artwork and a little bit about Mannerism in Cinquecento 1500s Italy. So we've already been talking about the Renaissance, but let's just review it briefly. The Renaissance is a cultural and artistic movement that happened in Europe beginning roughly in the 1400s and continuing through roughly to the middle of the 17th century. And it's based on the rediscovery of the culture of ancient Greece and Rome and a renewed interest in human experience. So in all of these artworks that we see pictured on the bottom, we can see an emphasis on the human form and the realistic depiction of the natural world. Again, an emphasis on human experience instead of the divine. Here are some notes on the High and Late Renaissance that will help you understand the artwork we look at. So during the High Renaissance, which is 1495 to 1520, and then in the Late Renaissance, which is 1520 up to 1600, we see artists who were usually given money by popes develop interests that refer to classical ideas, and most of the artwork that we're going to look at is religious because it was funded by the Catholic Church. Rome, Florence, and Venice were the centers of Renaissance artistic production because they were also some of the richest city-states in Italy during this time period. And some of the greatest Renaissance masters include Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci. And the greatest Venetian masters, who we'll just look at briefly, include Titian and Bellini. So, why was this artwork made, and who paid for it, and where is it? Well, most of what we look at is in Rome, and specifically in Vatican City, which is a small city within Rome that is the seat of the Catholic Church. The head of the Catholic Church is referred to as the Pope, and the popes during this time period were generally the patrons, so the people who gave money to artists to create very magnificent and overwhelming artifacts, whether they be architecture, sculpture, or painting. So most of this artwork was made in service of the Catholic Church, and much of it is housed in Vatican City. Although the artwork that we're going to be looking at is mostly religious, in it we can see a revival of humanism. And humanism is a Renaissance cultural movement that turned away from medieval scholasticism being study and interest in things that were mostly very Christian in their bent. And instead we see a revival of ancient Greek and Roman thought, which emphasized human experience. So humanism stresses the potential value and goodness of human beings, and emphasizes everything that's common about human experience, so the way that it feels to live within a body. And it also emphasizes and glorifies this idea that through work and education, humans can reach almost divine achievements through their life and work. I'm including here some images of ancient Greece and Rome, just so you get a kind of taste for what this was referring to. We're going to begin by looking at some works by Leonardo da Vinci, an artist I'm sure you've heard of one way or the other. Some notes about him: he was a superb master of line in both his drawing and painting. He's a pioneer of sfumato, a technique we'll talk about in a second, and he was also an inventor and a naturalist. So da Vinci constantly kept all of these notebooks, and within them he would jot down any ideas that he had about nature or inventions. He is credited with inventing a very early, although not entirely functional, flying machine, and he would often undertake dissections of human bodies so that he could better study human anatomy. All of his notes he wrote in a code that only he knew, so that nobody would be able to steal his ideas. This is one of his most famous pages from his sketchbooks. Leonardo is one of the pioneers of the technique called sfumato, and sfumato comes from the Latin word fumare, which means smoke, to smoke. And sfumato technique is just a technique of painting in which there are no harsh outlines present. Everything is hazy, although still quite detailed, which gives a more realistic illusion. So everything seems to kind of like melt atmospherically, but if you look up close, everything is still very, very finely painted. The composition of this painting had been worked and reworked, and everything within it is supposed to portray a sense of calm and balance and perfection in every single aspect. And from this slide, I want you to memorize the term. You don't necessarily need to memorize this image. Again, I want you to memorize this term as well, chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is a technique that was used both in painting and in drawing, in which the artist creates a strong sense of dark to light value to create a more realistic picture, because when there are strong shadows and highlights, you have more of an idea of the weight of the figures. Oftentimes this is done by using just one single light source. So you can imagine in this one here, you see how the highlights are falling here. You can imagine the light source being over here, and then hitting the image or hitting these figures, so that there's a strong sense of contrast of light to dark. Da Vinci was particularly good at doing this well and with a real sensitivity to the figure. Now this one here, I do want you to memorize this image. If you haven't already, this is the Mona Lisa, and what is perhaps most notable about this painting is the unified representation of objects in an atmospheric setting. So everything in here seems to be completely unified, including this sense of mystery. So we have the mystery and the smile of the sitter, and then this strange sort of almost sci-fi seeming mysterious background behind Mona Lisa. Why was the Mona Lisa so famous? Why are we all familiar with this image? There are a number of reasons. I would argue that it's not because it's the best painting ever made. Actually, this painting became famous because it was stolen. And when it was stolen, its image was reprinted everywhere because the Louvre was searching for the missing painting. And then when it was finally recaptured and brought back to the museum, people came and flocked to see it because they had been so familiar with the image that had been so famously stolen. It's also quite famous because it's very visually unified. Da Vinci composed it using the golden mean, and the golden mean is an ancient Greek mathematical idea that Da Vinci applied to the creation of flat images. And the golden mean is going to be used by artists following Da Vinci, but he's one of the first to really pioneer and perfect its usage. You'll probably also hear of any number of sort of conspiracy theories behind the image of the Mona Lisa. None of them has been uh, uh, successfully proved. During this time period, it was impossible to reproduce a painting through photography or printing, so it wasn't uncommon for an artist, a very famous artist, to have an artist paint alongside them while they were creating a painting, so that there would be multiple copies of a painting. So this here is a copy of a painting that was done alongside Da Vinci, so an artist was standing there trying to copy everything he did. And this is the image he created. This image, because it's not as famous as the Mona Lisa, has been restored by art conservators to its original colors. However, the Mona Lisa is so famous that nobody dares touch it or restore it because they don't want to quote-unquote ruin the image. But when it was first painted, its colors probably would have been just as vibrant as the one on the right. And on the one on the right, you can see, since it's been restored, that these sort of mysterious objects here on the edges of the painting are actually columns, because she's supposed to be sitting on some sort of a balcony. Moving on, let's look at the artwork of Raphael. And Raphael died quite young. potentially of syphilis, because he infamously enjoyed partying. He was a master painter, and he incorporated elements of both Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo into his style, but his style is considered more lightweight and lighthearted. He was trained by an artist named Perugino, and most famously, he painted images of the Madonna and Child. This is a painting of him here on the bottom. This is an image by Perugino. We glanced at it during the last module. And here on the right, we see a similar image painted by Raphael. Unlike the one by Perugino, you can see that this image is far more unified and doesn't feel as heavy-handed, or as the perspective in it isn't as blatantly straightforward as the one in Perugino. There's also a kind of sweetness to it, and a lightness to the figures. Everything feels very sweet and lighthearted in the work of Raphael. It's also very smooth, and there are no truly harsh edges. Here is one of his images of the Madonna in the meadow, and you can see that the infants are painted to be utterly sweet. Everything feels lightweight. The touch that the Madonna is giving to the young Christ, it seems to be so light that her fingertips barely touch his skin, and everything seems to be like fanciful and perfect. Part of this feeling of perfection in composition is brought about in part by the use of this triangle within the composition, and a triangle within compositions is very, very typical of Renaissance artwork because it gives a sense of unity. For those of you wondering what you might be able to do with the skill of oil painting today, some artists take their own canvases and paintings into museums and will create reproductions of famous oil paintings because there's quite a market for the sale of that kind of work. Let's look at some of the artwork of Michelangelo. Michelangelo was an all-around genius. He was a sculptor, a painter, and an architect, and absolutely the man in demand. However, he was also infamously moody and very difficult to work with. Here is his earliest masterpiece. This is the Pietà, and it was quite controversial when it was first unveiled, because look at the Virgin. Do you notice how young she appears? She appears to be almost younger than Christ. Many critics said that this was disrespectful, and he was portraying the Virgin as being too sexually attractive, too young to be the mother of Christ, and that it didn't portray real suffering. Michelangelo's counterattack was that the Virgin was so holy that her holiness kept her pure. Whatever the case, the church did end up taking this sculpture, and it is quite famous because it is so beautifully done. Look at the drapery, look at how well and how very carefully all of the folds are portrayed. Look at the attention that's lavished on the anatomy of the dead Christ and the way that his body seems to absolutely droop into her arms, which also was a point of some argument, because how could the Virgin possibly be holding the body of the dead Christ as though it were so lightweight? Again, Michelangelo said that this was because Christ himself was so pure that his body weighed almost nothing. A controversial statue, to be sure, and reached some more controversy in the 70s when this man here, Laszlo Toth, a geologist who began to lose his mind, decided to take a hammer used to cut stone, and he hacked off the arm from the statue because he said that it was too beautiful and it caused him to believe in God, although he later lost his faith. He was, after this incident, put in a mental health hospital, and the sculpture has since been restored. This is David, carved by Michelangelo. The biblical character of David is famous for having killed a giant with a sling, and a sling is kind of like a slingshot. That's what this sculpture is slinging over his shoulder there. This image would have been put on top of a building, and if you look at it now, you can notice the emphasis on the hands and the face. They're a little bit larger proportionally than they maybe should be. However, since this was placed on top of a building, Michelangelo sculpted it this way so that when people were viewing it down from below, the hands and the face, which are very important expressive elements, would have been visible even from a great distance. This is, when it was created, the tallest marble sculpture to be created by an artist of this time period. It's 17 feet tall. So when it was finally removed from Michelangelo's studio, it took a crew of men working with large marble, or working with large pieces of wood as rollers to transport the piece. It's monumental in its size, but it's also monumental in its achievement of accurately portraying the human form in such a challenging material, and so accurately in terms of anatomy. Notice the contrapposto stance, and the perfection of the figure and its face. All of these things refer to ancient Greece and Rome. So again, a revival of the classical. Michelangelo was also a skilled painter, although he didn't like painting at all, and the Pope had to actually force him to paint the Sistine Chapel. He was still a teenager when he began painting the Sistine Chapel, but it took him years to finish. The chapel is painted in a series of scenes that depict stories from the Bible. Because many people who attended church at this time period would have been illiterate, images like this would have helped them understand the stories that were being told in church. So we can see in the beginning here we have God creating Adam, followed by the expulsion out of the garden, and so on and so forth. The creation of Adam is arguably the most famous image from the Sistine Chapel. You'll see it reproduced everywhere. We see that all of the figures in it are very muscular. This is so that Michelangelo could display his knowledge of anatomy and where human muscles go and how. The image itself is very compositionally balanced, and there are quite a few theories about this, saying that perhaps this shape of the drapery is supposed to represent a womb, and this is Adam being born out of God's womb. Again, it's open enough to interpretation so that people can discuss it endlessly. That's on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. On the far wall, the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, is this large image of the Last Judgment. And in an interesting detail of it, we have a saint here who is holding a skin, because this saint was skinned to death. But the skin itself is said to have the face of Michelangelo. So Michelangelo inserted a self-portrait in this giant image of the Last Judgment. Michelangelo also dealt in architecture. He was in his 70s when he helped finalize and perfect the plan for St. Peter's Church. St. Peter's Church is the central church of Vatican City, which is the heart of the Catholic Church. Before Michelangelo reworked the plans for the Cathedral of St. Peter, it was far more square in shape, and he added these extra little corners to it, so that the plan, when seen above, seems more like almost like a snowflake, and within it envelops you, so it doesn't feel square at all. And the large dome on the top of it, which Michelangelo was also involved in creating, rivals the size of the dome that we looked at in the chapter before. It's enormous. Also, these columns in front of it, with the addition of the dome, are all reminiscent of architecture from ancient Rome. but the excessive ornamentation and detail and the amount of light that streams into the church is very different from classical architecture and really emphasizes the divinity of the space. The square in front of the church here too of St. Peter's is designed so that it slopes slightly downward so that people, when approaching the church, look and feel utterly dwarfed by its enormity. And then briefly, let's look at some examples of Mannerism. Mannerism is a different artistic style, and it's a style in contrast to the naturalism of the High Renaissance. So the artwork that we were looking at before looked more or less realistic. It was the artwork of the High Renaissance. Mannerist artists were more interested in expressive artwork rather than classical naturalistic artwork. So some of the basic features of Mannerism are elongated figures, figura serpentinata, which means a figure that's kind of snake-like. It's stretched out and moving in a funny way. There's less emphasis on balance, symmetry, and rational composition, which is what the High Renaissance is all about. And there's strange lighting. So in this here, this is from Florence, and this is by Pontormo. It portrays a religious image. It's the entombment of Christ, so Christ being put into a tomb. But you can see that unlike the other paintings that we were looking at, there's no triangle here to unify all of the figures. The background is sort of like strange and dreamlike. There's just a single cloud, but we have no real idea what these people are standing on. All the figures seem to be stretched out a little bit longer than they would be in normal life. The colors are quite strange. This guy here, my eye can't stop going back to him because he appears to be wearing some kind of pink unitard thing, and these like strange bright pink cloths that are draped all over everyone seem excessively unnatural. Necks seem to turn further than they should, and everything, in other words, is incredibly elevated in a way that almost makes no sense. The figures are swirling, and this is an image of an entombment, meaning that Christ is supposed to be placed into a grave. So we assume that the grave is somewhere, and either they're falling back into the hole, or maybe the hole is where we, the viewer, is standing. Everything about it is far more open-ended and lends itself to questioning and thought in a way that the artwork of the High Renaissance doesn't really. This here is Bronzino, and it's an oil painting, and it's one of those oil paintings where you can really see that Bronzino used oil to paint every detail with loving attention. I'm quite a fan of this artwork because it's so strange and seems to contain so many conflicting images and ideas at once. Cupid was said to be the son of Venus, and here's Cupid, and he's giving his mom what seems to be a very sensual kiss. And this here is folly, so folly, you know, is like a mistake, and in this case it's the form of a toddler who's about to throw roses on this mother and son who are kissing and expose them to all of the other gods who are waiting in the background. We have this here, some sort of temptress figure with the body of a snake. We have drama, we have the purity of a dove. Everything is contained within the painting. Imagine the rich family that commissioned this staring at it and puzzling over the symbolism and the meaning of this image for generations. It all refers back to classical times in reference to Greek mythology, but the way in which it's painted is definitely done with a nod to the High Renaissance. And with that, we end the lecture. Thank you so much.